The fire started at 03:42 local time. It was supposed to be a routine inspection of the Norellian diplomatic annex on Earth. Built 3 years ago in the industrial district of Dayton, Ohio, it was one of the few Earth-based structures modified to accommodate species that breathed argon-rich atmospheres. The building wasn't flashy, just functional, smartly pressurized, and filled with all sorts of safety redundancies. But someone somewhere cut corners. By 03:53, the entire east wing was engulfed in flames. The fire suppression systems failed. The emergency doors jammed. The structure buckled in places it wasn't supposed to. The Norellian delegation had been asleep in their sleeping chambers when the alarms went off. At 03:58, firefighter Franklin Doss arrived with Engine 7. Dispatch says 6 trapped, non-human. Room 212C and 213B, the captain shouted over the radio. Franklin adjusted his oxygen mask. Copy that? The smoke was thick, too thick for anyone to see more than a few feet ahead. He entered through the side loading dock where the walls hadn't yet collapsed. The heat singed his arms even through the gear. "Frank, you're not going in alone." One of the other firefighters barked through the comms, but Franklin didn't answer. He'd already pushed through the buckled door toward Corridor C. Room 212C was barely standing. The door had melted into the frame. Inside, Ambassador Creel was collapsed by the vent shaft, his limbs twitching slowly. He was over 7 feet tall, covered in mottled scales that had begun to blister from the heat. Franklin dropped to his knees. "Hey, can you move?" Creel lifted his head weakly. 4 more in 213B. 1 in the water chamber. Franklin slung the ambassador over his shoulder. He was heavy, easily 200 pounds. Franklin's knees buckled for a second, but he caught himself. As he turned to leave, the ceiling behind him gave out. A beam dropped, smashing the wall between 212C and 213B. "Franklin, we're seeing collapse on your side. Get out of there now," someone shouted through the radio. "I've got hostiles in 213B, Franklin replied, coughing. "Going in." The fire hissed violently as it reached the argon storage tanks. Something exploded down the hall. He kicked the door to 213B, which barely budged. He dropped Creel to the floor gently, then backed up and slammed against the door with his shoulder. It cracked open on the 3rd try. Inside, the heat was worse. The walls were glowing. One Norellian, a female named Vessa, was dragging another unconscious diplomat toward the wall vent. Her own legs burned black from the knees down. Franklin charged in and grabbed both. "I've got you. Hold on." I can't stand," Vessa choked. "You don't have to. Just breathe." He carried one under each arm, staggered back toward the hallway where Creel lay. The smoke was so thick now he couldn't see the door anymore. He wrapped his gloved hand around the hose on his belt and used it to guide himself, dragging all 3 toward the exit. The building groaned above him. A pipe burst near his leg, scalding water searing through his pant leg. He screamed and stumbled forward, falling onto the concrete. He pushed himself up with one arm. His left leg shook violently under his weight. "Franklin," the radio crackled, "you're almost out." 15 more feet. You've got to move." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He adjusted the unconscious diplomat on his back and leaned heavily on his right side. He took 1 step, then another. His leg buckled again, but he didn't fall this time. He emerged through the dock door at 04:18, smoke pouring out behind him. He collapsed to his knees as paramedics rushed forward. 3 Norellians, 1 conscious, 2 unresponsive, he gasped. 1 more in the water chamber. Didn't reach him. Franklin passed out before the medics could respond. By 0500, he was in surgery. The steam burns on his left leg had gone deep 3rd degree, with tissue damage down to the muscle. His lungs were irritated from smoke inhalation. He had a minor concussion and a dislocated shoulder from the impact with the door. Doctors at Dayton Mercy said recovery would take weeks, maybe longer depending on how his leg responded to grafts. "I need to get back there," Franklin muttered when he woke up 12 hours later, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube. There's still one left. The nurse looked at him, stunned. Sir, the building collapsed. They're not sending anyone in. I didn't check the water chamber. You need to rest. I need, he groaned sharply, clenching his teeth as his leg twitched violently. I need to know. In a sealed medical room 1 floor below, Ambassador Creel stirred. His skin was raw, patches of scale missing. Vesa lay beside him, her legs wrapped in thick bandages, a ventilator over her mouth. The other diplomat was still unconscious. Creel turned his head slowly toward the human nurse monitoring the machines. Where is the one who carried us? He whispered. The nurse blinked. You mean Franklin? Creel nodded slightly. He should not have survived that heat. He's alive. Barely. Creel closed his eyes. He came back for all of us. The nurse adjusted the Roman 4 line. Yeah, she said quietly. He did. At 08:16 the next morning, a low-ranking attaché named Seleth was escorted into the secure wing of Dayton Mercy Hospital. He wore a silver filtration mask that fit awkwardly over his elongated snout, and his cloak bore the insignia of the Norellian Interplanetary Consulate, though it was slightly askew, as if he'd dressed in haste. A human administrator met him outside the door with a clipboard and tired eyes. You'll have 15 minutes. No physical contact and don't tamper with the equipment. If you need translation, tap the red button. Seleth tilted his head. Your protocol assumes we'd attempt sabotage. Curious. We had someone try to plug in a data wand to a ventilator last year, she replied without blinking. 15 minutes. She unlocked the door and let him in. The room was dim, filtered through soft blue lighting tuned to Norellian comfort levels. Vesa lay asleep under a thermal sheet, her breathing steady. Creel was awake, reclining on an elevated cot, his left arm twitching periodically. Diagnostic bands glowed faintly on both wrists. Seleth approached slowly. You look like a boiled crustacean, he said. I feel like one, Creel rasped. Has the council convened? They've postponed until we can confirm no further casualties, Seleth said. You're listed as stable, which has calmed the diplomatic lines somewhat, but they want a full account. Creel's eyes narrowed. Then listen carefully. Seleth activated a small recorder on his wrist. Creel didn't speak right away. He studied the ceiling for a long moment, then flexed his fingers experimentally. He returned twice, not once. He could barely move by the end. Seleth shifted uncomfortably. Did he ask for compensation or political leverage? No, he asked if the water chamber had been cleared. Strange priority. Not for him. Seleth examined the vitals display. You're certain he wasn't under some kind of chemical influence? We've seen erratic behavior in Terrans under stress, Creel exhaled slowly. He was in pain. He wasn't reckless, just determined. You weren't there, Seleth. The building was coming apart. He was dragging me through boiling air, and he still asked if anyone was left. Seleth fell silent. Creel finally turned his head. He should not have been able to carry us. What do you mean? I know my own weight, Creel said. I know what Vesa and Lauren weigh together, and I saw the damage to his leg. His body should have failed. Seleth adjusted the mask on his snout. You're suggesting what? That they're stronger than we calculated? I'm suggesting we've misunderstood them. The door opened behind Seleth before he could respond. A nurse stepped in quietly. Ambassador, the human has regained full consciousness. He's asking to see you. Creel gripped the edge of the bed. Can I? You'll need assistance. I'll crawl if I must. The nurse nodded. We'll bring a chair. By 08:45, Creel was wheeled into the neighboring recovery suite. Franklin Doss lay propped up in a reclining bed, pale and drenched in sweat. A plastic brace ran the length of his leg and his arm was immobilized. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were open and focused. Creel studied him for several seconds before speaking. You are. Not what I expected. Franklin winced as he shifted. You're not the first to say that. Creel gestured to the empty chair beside him, which a nurse quickly filled. May I ask something without offending you? Sure, Franklin said. I'm too drugged to be offended. Why did you return? Franklin blinked once. What do you mean, you carried 3 of us out, you collapsed, and then you tried to go back? You had no protective gear left, your leg was failing, and you still tried. Franklin stared at the ceiling. There was one left, in the chamber. Creel tilted his head slightly. We've recovered him. He was submerged and insulated by the tank's coolant. He survived. Franklin let out a breath that sounded like a laugh, but without any humor. Good. That doesn't answer the question. Franklin's brow furrowed. He looked at his hand curled awkwardly in the brace. I don't know how to say it in the right words. It wasn't a choice. It was just what had to be done. Creel's scales shifted along his temples, a Norellian sign of unease. We've cataloged hundreds of Terran behavioral responses under duress. None of them account for this kind of persistence. You weren't protecting your own. I didn't need them to be mine, Franklin said. They were trapped. That was enough. Creel turned to the nurse. Leave us. The nurse hesitated, then nodded and stepped out. Creel leaned forward slightly. You don't understand what you've done, Franklin frowned. I didn't do it for politics, I know. That's why it matters. Franklin's voice dropped. I didn't expect to get out. I knew that when I went back in. Silence stretched between them. Creel finally said, we have protocols. When disaster strikes, we're trained to assess risk, preserve leadership, stabilize outcomes. You didn't assess, you acted. That's not always a good thing, Franklin said. No. But sometimes, it changes everything. At 0913, Creel was wheeled back to his room. Seelith was waiting. Well, he doesn't understand the implications, Creel said, but the others will. You mean the council? I mean everyone. Seelith folded his arms. They'll want to verify the account. They can verify what they like. He didn't do it for recognition. Seelith looked toward the glass separating the 2 rooms. That's the part I can't understand. Creel closed his eyes. Neither can I. At 0947, a report was transmitted to the Norellian Central Council with a single header. Subject: Unanticipated Human Response Emergency Context. Attached were 3 minutes of audio from Creel's own recorder. By 10:02, the report had reached orbit. At 14:02 that same day, a Norellian transport vessel descended over Wright-Patterson Airfield, cloaked in a haze of static meant to interfere with civilian broadcasts. The ship was not ornate diplomatic vessels, rarely were, but its arrival was enough to send a ripple of unease through the Emergency Operations Center 2 miles away. Inside the hospital, Franklin Doss was struggling to sit upright without assistance. The nurse, a slender woman with a low tolerance for nonsense, had warned him no fewer than 4 times to stay horizontal. He ignored her each time and now sat halfway between sitting and sliding, clutching the guardrail of his bed with both hands. What time is it? He muttered through clenched teeth. The nurse didn't look up from her tablet. Too early for you to be trying this. I feel like I've been run over by a cement truck. That's because you have. Now lie back down. I need to stretch. You need functioning skin. He gave up and let gravity win, easing himself down with a frustrated grunt. The brace on his leg itched like madness. Every nerve below his knee felt like it belonged to someone else. At 14:31, the door opened, and he turned his head expecting a doctor. Instead, 3 Norellians filed in, each wearing dark robes with intricate gold threading thin, almost imperceptible lines that shimmered when they moved. The first was taller than Creel, with a rigid posture and eyes that didn't blink immediately. The second seemed younger, perhaps an aide, and carried a folded device that looked like a scroll but buzzed softly. The third moved more slowly, observing every surface before stepping forward. Franklin blinked. You're not with the hospital, the tall one spoke without preamble. I am Envoy Halrin of the Inner Diplomatic Council. These are my analysts, Ver and Sen. May we speak with you? I don't think I can stop you. That is not the question. Franklin gestured vaguely at the chair near the window. Yeah, fine. They did not sit. Halrin stepped closer to the foot of the bed and studied the medical readouts for less than a second. You retrieved 3 of our delegation under conditions that would disable most species. You exited a failing structure while carrying double your own mass. These are not idle observations. Franklin rubbed his eyes. Is there a reason you're all talking like I invented gravity? Halloran tilted his head slightly. We review incident responses across hundreds of worlds. This one is irregular. I didn't do anything special. Ver, the younger of the two analysts, stepped forward. You entered a structure deemed structurally unsalvageable. You evacuated multiple persons through active collapse zones. You re-entered after showing clear signs of trauma. You did not know their names, you had no prior link to them, and you were aware of the odds. Franklin sighed. I knew there were people inside, that was enough. Halloran narrowed his gaze. That is the part we cannot model. I didn't do it to confuse your models, Franklin said, his voice flat. I did it because someone had to. I didn't think about calculations or odds. I just moved. You ignored survival probability. I didn't ignore anything. I just didn't let it stop me. Sen, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. We have a word for that in our language. It translates roughly to sacrificial spiral, a behavior pattern that escalates risk to preserve others. We associate it with cognitive decline. Franklin gave a tired laugh. Thanks. It was not meant as insult, Sen said. It's simply alien to us. Halloran stepped back, folding his hands behind his back. You were not trained for this kind of rescue. No, you were not genetically selected for resilience, not last I checked. Then why did you not stop? Franklin stared at the ceiling. Because I thought I could make it. I thought if I pushed hard enough, I could get them out, and if I didn't try, I'd have to live with that. Ver's scroll device beeped softly. He glanced at it, then looked to Halloran. The Council has received confirmation. The last individual has stabilized. No fatalities. Halloran gave a single nod, then turned back to Franklin. You altered the outcome of an international incident through force of will alone. You do not grasp what that means. I'm not trying to change the galaxy, Franklin said. I'm trying to heal enough to walk again. The Norellians fell silent. Then, without warning, Halloran reached into his cloak and produced a small case. He opened it, revealing a band of material that shimmered in layers of green and black. This is a recognition strand, he said. Most often awarded posthumously, it marks an act of selfless intervention on behalf of another species. Franklin stared at it. I don't want a medal. It's not a medal, it's a record. It will be embedded in our diplomatic archives for as long as they exist. I don't care about being remembered. Then you are precisely the kind of being who should be. Ver stepped forward and offered the strand. Franklin hesitated, then accepted it with his good hand. It was lighter than he expected and warm not from heat but something else, like it carried a pulse. Sen nodded once. We have what we need. As they turned to go, Franklin spoke again. Wait, did they say anything? The ones I carried, Halloran paused. Yes, they said they didn't understand you. But they were glad they met you. The door closed behind them. At 16:09, Franklin was alone again. He stared at the strand in his lap, then at the ceiling, then finally closed his eyes. The pain in his leg hadn't dulled and might not for days. Every breath still felt like dragging gravel through his chest. But for the first time since waking up, he allowed himself to exhale fully. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the window. By 1932, the rain had turned to sleet. Franklin Doss had drifted in and out of shallow sleep, his body caught somewhere between the haze of painkillers and the gnawing ache that refused to vanish. He'd stopped trying to shift positions. The brace locked his knee at an awkward angle, and his shoulder throbbed every time he breathed too deeply. The recognition strand lay untouched on the table beside him, still faintly humming, like it wasn't quite inert. At 1940, a quiet knock tapped once on the door. It opened without waiting for an answer. This time, it wasn't another delegation or a nurse with a clipboard. The Norellian who stepped in was smaller than the others Franklin had seen, barely taller than a human. Her robe was pale gray, and where most of her kind moved with a certain rigid grace, she walked with uneven steps, Like every motion was being consciously measured, Franklin blinked and tried to sit up. "You're not one of the ones I carried." "No," she said, voice softer than the others. "I'm not." She moved to the edge of the room and stood beside the window. The sleet tapped against the glass in erratic rhythms. "I'm Jurin, I'm not counsel, I'm not envoy, I'm just related." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "To who?" "Vesa, she's my sibling pair. Our growth cycles diverged, so we look nothing alike." She glanced at him sideways. "She's always been the stronger one." He let out a low exhale. "She's the one who was trying to pull someone toward the vent." Then it was her. Jurin walked to the foot of the bed, her gaze flicking to the recognition strand. "You didn't put it on." "I don't know what I'd do with it. I don't think it goes with the gown." Jurin's eyes didn't leave his. "You saved her. I wasn't here. I wasn't even on your planet. I was on a freighter, docked near Ganymede. Got the news 2 hours after it happened." Franklin swallowed. "She's going to make it." "I know. I got to see her an hour ago. She told me enough to know what you did." He looked away. "I didn't think it would matter to anyone else." "It does," Jurin said. "Not because of what she is, but because of what you did." He shifted under the sheets. "I keep hearing that, like I'm supposed to have some deep explanation. I don't. I saw people in trouble." "I moved." Jurin was quiet for a long while, then she said, "I've pulled people out of wreckage before, explosive decompression once. I was trained for it. I knew the risks. I had the suit, the breather, the tether line. Everything was calculated." Franklin glanced at her. "Your military was," she said. "Not anymore." "What happened?" "I didn't go back in a second time." He didn't speak. Jurin stepped closer, her voice steady. "We were clearing a collapsed corridor. I got one out. The second one was still pinned behind a failed bulkhead. I paused. I ran the odds. They weren't good, so I waited for backup." "That's what you were trained to do." "I know, and they lived, but they lost both legs because I waited." Franklin met her gaze. "I ran the odds," she repeated. "You didn't." "I didn't have time," he said. "I didn't plan to be a symbol." "You aren't one," she said. "You're a wound. You showed all of us what it looks like when someone doesn't flinch." He looked down at his hands. "I flinched. I just didn't stop." At 2012, the room dimmed slightly. The hospital's lighting system had shifted to night mode. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow. Flakes gathered on the narrow sill beyond the window, forming misshapen clumps that reflected the faint red of the emergency lights across the street. Jurin sat down in the chair beside his bed, folding her hands in her lap. "I asked to come see you," she said. "Not as a political gesture. I didn't want to read about it in filtered transcripts. I wanted to see the person who made me question how I froze." Franklin didn't answer. She leaned back. "Vesa said you were limping the whole way out, that your leg was going. It was already gone. She also said you didn't let her apologize." He blinked. "Apologize for what? For not being able to walk, for making you carry her?" Franklin's jaw tightened. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all week." She said that's what you told her. "I meant it." Jurin watched him for a few seconds. "You know, we don't usually ask for help from outside our kind. It's not arrogance. It's just our history. We were conditioned to be self-contained. You shattered that without a speech, without even knowing our names." Franklin looked tired. "You keep saying I shattered something. I didn't. I just didn't want anyone to die, that's all. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a message. That's why it worked." At 2046, a soft chime echoed in the hall. Jurin stood. "I'm not supposed to stay past visiting hours," she said. "And I've already pushed the limit." Franklin nodded. She reached into her robe and pulled out a small object about the size of a coin. It shimmered faintly, not like the recognition strand, but in a subtler way, like it was reflecting a memory. "I got this after my first rescue," she said. "It's not official or ceremonial, just a token. You carry it when you need to remember the ones you couldn't reach." She placed it on the table beside the strand. "I don't deserve it," Franklin said. Jurin paused at the door. "No one ever does, that's the point." Then she was gone. By 2110, Franklin was alone again. He didn't reach for either token. Not yet. He stared at the ceiling, then let his eyes fall closed. The ache in his chest had dulled, but it wasn't gone. He didn't expect it to be, not for a long time. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the machines hummed softly, marking each breath, each beat, each moment forward. At 06:11 the following morning, Franklin Doss was awake before the nurses made their first rounds. The snow had hardened into a crust across the window pane, and the hospital's heating system clicked rhythmically through the wall. He lay in silence, staring at the ceiling, his arm still bound tightly across his chest, leg encased in a brace that ran from thigh to ankle. He hadn't slept. Not really. The painkillers dulled the edges of everything, but his thoughts still pressed in from all sides. At 06:57, he asked for the window blinds to be raised. The light that filtered in was a flat gray, the kind that didn't change much throughout the day. By 08:12, a new face appeared in the doorway. Not medical staff. Not Norellian. A man in a windbreaker with a lanyard tucked into his front pocket stepped in holding 2 cups of coffee, one of which he offered without asking. Franklin narrowed his eyes. Who sent you? Technically. The Department of Intercultural Liaisons, but unofficially. No one wants to spook the Norellians by barging in too early, so I drew the short straw. Franklin took the cup with his good hand but didn't drink. You're not wearing a badge. I'm not here to question you. The man pulled up the chair, sat down, and sipped his own coffee. I'm just here to listen. I've read the reports. But there's always a gap between reports and what actually happened. What do you want to know? The man took another sip, set the cup down. Not about the fire, that's all been logged. I want to know what it felt like. Franklin stared at him. You want a feeling. It felt like being boiled alive while dragging furniture through an earthquake. I'm not trying to be cruel. Then why are you asking questions like that? Because the Norellians have started calling you the fulcrum, quietly, but it's spreading. Franklin blinked. That's not a word I expected. They mean it like this, the thing everything pivots around, not the center, not the cause, just the point that changes the angle of everything else. Franklin looked away. I didn't ask for that. No one thinks you did. He shifted against the pillow, winced. Look, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I don't want to be anyone's symbol. I didn't save the galaxy, I just didn't leave people behind. That's the part they're struggling with. Well, I don't know how to make it easier for them. The man leaned forward. You don't have to. But they're going to keep trying to make sense of you, Franklin frowned. Why me? Anyone else on that crew would have done the same. Maybe, but they didn't. He let that sit between them for a while. The wall monitor beeped once, then resumed its low, steady rhythm. Finally, Franklin said, I don't want them building shrines or rewriting policies because of something I wasn't even thinking about. I was just trying to keep people from dying. Then make them understand that. How? Talk to them. Franklin shook his head. You think a speech is going to fix this? No, but a conversation might. By 09:00, the man was gone, leaving both cups behind. At 10:36, 2 Norellians arrived without announcement. These weren't officials or relatives. They wore plain tunics, and one had what looked like an old-fashioned translator clipped to her ear. They entered like people who weren't sure if they were welcome. Franklin looked up from the untouched coffee. You here for something in particular? The taller one nodded. We were on the maintenance crew, stationed in the annex. I'm Tell, this is Kerr. Kerr gave a small motion with her fingers that Franklin guessed was a greeting. Tell stepped closer. We weren't in the building when it went up. We were on the roof access tunnel, working on a pressure valve. The alarms tripped, but the comms were already down. Franklin's head tilted. You're saying you were still there? We were the ones who pulled the last occupant out of the water chamber, the one you didn't reach. Franklin stared at him. You were the ones who got him out, Kerr nodded. We got in once the fire thinned. We had to bypass the hatch manually. Took us 7 minutes. We found him unconscious in the coolant basin. Franklin's breath caught. So you saved him? No, Tell said. You bought the time. We just used it. Kerr stepped forward, holding out a small object wrapped in a thermal cloth. He left this behind. We thought you should have it. Franklin took it carefully. It was a metallic cylinder about the size of his palm, smooth, faintly warm. He didn't recognize the material, but something about the balance of it felt deliberate. "It's a breathstone," Tell said. "They're carried by those who work in high-risk immersion chambers. It holds the last exhalation before entering a sealed unit." He dropped it. He clipped it to the vent rail, standard practice, but his was different. He had it etched. Franklin turned it slowly. On the underside, barely visible, were small characters, Norellian script etched with care. "What does it say?" Kerr smiled faintly. "It says, if I don't return, let this breath carry someone else." Franklin closed his fingers around it. Tell shifted his weight. "You didn't know him, but you carried him in your thoughts." "I didn't have to know him." Kerr tilted her head. "That's the part we're all still trying to understand." "I didn't understand it either," Franklin said. "It just felt like the only thing I could do." Tell gave a respectful nod. Then it was more than enough. At 11:22 they left without ceremony. Franklin sat quietly for a long time, the breathstone resting in his lap. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heating vents and the dull ache in his leg that never quite faded. At 12:15, the nurse returned to check his vitals. "You've got another visitor," she said, flipping through the chart. Franklin didn't look up. "Is it another diplomat?" "No, a kid," he blinked. "A what?" "Teenager. Says he's with the emergency cadet program. Wanted to ask you something." Franklin sighed. "Send him in." A few minutes later, a skinny boy in a dark red cadet jacket stood nervously at the door, shifting from foot to foot. "You're Franklin Doss, last I checked." "I'm Theo. I'm training to be a rescue tech. They assigned us to study the incident." "I just wanted to ask one question." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Theo hesitated. "Were you scared?" Franklin didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he said finally. "More than I've ever been. I thought I was going to die. I thought I wouldn't get back out. But I was more afraid of not trying than I was of failing." Theo nodded, eyes wide. "Okay, that's what I needed to know." He turned to leave, then paused. "My instructor said fear's a signal, not a stop sign." Franklin smiled for the first time that day. "Your instructor's got the right idea." At 12:47, the room was quiet again. Two objects now sat on the bedside table, a breathstone and a recognition strand. Neither one told the full story. But together they were starting to. By 08:06 on the fourth day since the fire, the snow had started to melt, leaving streaks of slush along the hospital windows. A thin sun fought its way through the haze, casting long shadows through the recovery wing. Franklin Doss sat upright for the first time without assistance, his shoulder now out of the immobilizer. His leg, still sheathed in its brace, rested on a cushioned support, but he could bend the knee by a few degrees without grinding pain, a milestone he measured without ceremony. At 08:31, a quiet knock preceded the arrival of Vesa. Her gait was halting but resolute, metal supports clipped to her lower limbs to steady her movement. The burns on her legs had healed unevenly, the scales regrown in jagged patterns, but she walked without help. Her robe was simple, dark violet, and she carried nothing with her. Franklin raised his eyebrows. "Didn't expect to see you walking this soon." "I wasn't expected to walk at all," she said, "but I'm stubborn." "Must be contagious," he said. Vesa moved to the window, resting her hand lightly on the sill. "I heard about the boy who visited you." "You mean Theo?" She nodded. "Our people don't start emergency training until maturity." Seeing someone that young already preparing to face danger, it unsettled some of our delegation. I thought it was kind of hopeful. That's what unsettled them. Franklin reached for his water glass. "You came here for something?" "No. I came because I didn't know how to leave Earth without seeing you again." He took a sip. "You heading out soon?" "Tomorrow. Our transport finishes cycling at dawn. Creel's going back with us." "You're cleared to travel." "They said I'd recover better in Norellian gravity." "But I wanted to walk here first, without supports." He leaned back, watching her. "You made it." Vesa didn't sit. She remained at the window, letting the light catch her profile. "Our species rarely speak openly about debt. We believe mutual benefit is more stable." "But I've been thinking about something I never asked you." He set the cup down. "Go ahead." When you found me, I was dragging Lauren. I couldn't feel my legs. I was panicking. I remember thinking I'd failed before anyone even reached us. And then you. You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask who we were or why we hadn't made it farther. I wasn't keeping score. That's what I want to understand. Why didn't you? He rubbed the side of his face where faint pink still marked skin that had been blistered. Because if I stopped to measure it, I'd have lost time. I wasn't trying to make a judgment call, I was trying to get you out. Vesa turned, facing him fully. On Norellia, we're taught that hesitation protects lives, that data must precede action, but you moved on instinct and it worked. That's not easy for us to reconcile. Maybe it doesn't need reconciling, he said. Maybe it's just different, she stepped closer. That's not how our culture works. We don't allow just different when it comes to crisis protocol. We standardize, we optimize. Franklin tilted his head. Then maybe your protocols need to make room for what doesn't make sense. Vesa studied him in silence, then gave the faintest nod. I've filed a proposal to the council, nothing official, but I included a recommendation for joint response training with Terran fire units. He raised his eyebrows. That's a first, isn't it? It's not expected to pass, not yet, but it will be entered into record. He looked at her with a faint smile. You didn't have to do that. I didn't do it for you. I did it for the next time someone's trapped and doesn't look like anyone else in the room. That silenced them both for a moment. At 09:12, the door opened again. Creel stepped in, walking under his own power, though with a slight limp. The mottled scars across his left arm were less pronounced now, and his eyes had regained their usual sharp focus. I wasn't sure you'd be awake, he said. I've had better weeks, Franklin said, gesturing to the chair. Grab a seat. Creel sat without hesitation. We've been asked not to elevate your actions further. The council believes too much focus on one individual distorts policy. That's fine, Franklin said. I'm not trying to be a statue. That's fortunate, Creel said. Because despite their silence, they've already begun adjusting internal criteria for heroic intervention scenarios. Quietly, without attribution, Franklin blinked. They're rewriting rules. They're renaming thresholds, Creel corrected. What was once considered excessive risk is now being reframed as context-dependent. Vesa added, your actions are becoming a new edge case. I'm not even fully healed, Franklin muttered. That's why they're doing it quietly, Creel said. They're afraid people will try to emulate you before understanding what it cost. Franklin looked down at his brace. It cost a lot. That's why it matters. At 09:47, a hospital administrator knocked and entered with a wheeled cart. On it sat a single document in a translucent case. She placed it by Franklin's bedside. This came in from the Interspecies Recognition Board, she said. It's not public, but it's official. Franklin opened the case. Inside was a certificate, its text printed in both Terran Standard and Norellian glyphs. It was brief. One paragraph. No grand declarations, just a statement of fact, acknowledging an action taken in disregard for personal outcome in defense of non-human lives. He closed the case without reading it aloud. I don't want a parade. You won't get one, Creel said. But you've been entered into our diplomatic archives as a non-aligned responder. That status comes with a travel exception. Franklin raised an eyebrow. Meaning? If you ever need to leave Earth, we'll transport you, no conditions. No questions? I didn't know that was a thing. It wasn't, Vesa said. Until now. At 10:31, they stood to leave. Vesa extended a hand, not the Norellian gesture of respect, but a human handshake. Franklin took it, his grip careful but steady. You walked through fire for us, she said. We'll remember that longer than any document will survive, Creel gave a nod. You didn't just save lives, you changed how we understand risk, and maybe how we understand each other. Franklin leaned back against the pillow. Then I guess it was worth it. They left without fanfare. At 11 o'clock, the nurse returned with discharge papers. The grafts had taken. The leg would heal. He'd walk again without the brace, though not without a new gait. His lungs had cleared. His shoulder would regain full range with therapy. At 1312, Franklin Doss stepped out of Dayton Mercy Hospital under his own power, cane in hand. Snow melted to wet concrete beneath his boots. No cameras, no speeches. Just one man moving forward. No one needed to carry anyone anymore.